call the member for Ballina.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in support of the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill 2021, and as a co-sponsor of the bill, I proudly stand with the other 27 co-sponsors in bringing this important and long overdue change in the law. I thank the member for Sydney for initiating this legislation and for the open and transparent way that he has engaged with all members and the broader community about the details and intention of this law. Thank you to all of the constituents in the Ballina electorate and beyond who have written to me to express their views. Overwhelmingly, people in my area have expressed strong support for this important law reform. People have shared with me heartbreaking stories of personal experience of watching loved ones with terminal illnesses at end of life for whom palliative care could not alleviate their suffering. And I think it's incredibly important to reiterate that it is terminal illnesses, end of life, and people able to make that decision. I'm incredibly grateful to Dying with Dignity New South Wales and Go Gentle Australia for their ongoing tireless work and their incredible resources, including State of Suffering New South Wales, testimonies of the damage done in the absence of a voluntary assisted dying law. Thank you to everyone who contributed their testimonies to that, and in particular my own constituent Kathy Barry, who was featured in that and who wrote about the terrible suffering of her brother Tom. It is not easy to talk about the pain of watching a loved one die in suffering, and for whom palliative care as it stands in New South Wales cannot assist. Thank you for your courage in sharing those stories. Thank you also to the 100 doctors, the AIDS Council of New South Wales, Cancer Voices New South Wales, Australian Lawyers Alliance, Humanists Australia, Christians Supporting Choice for Voluntary Assisted Dying, the Rationalist Society of Australia, the National Secular Lobby, Marquee Lawyers and Nicholas Cowdery AOQC for all of your submissions, and I note that I rely on your work in my speech. The New South Wales Greens have a long history of supporting a terminally ill person's right to voluntary assisted dying and to die with dignity at the end of life with important safeguards to protect them from abuses. As we know, most states in Australia have voluntary assisted dying laws, and many, many democratic countries around the world have had these laws for many years. I do not support the argument made here today that these laws open up extreme euthanasia laws or send a signal to people that if they are suffering, they should take their own life. As a person who has experienced a close and loved person taking their own life and experiencing loved ones at end of life who would have benefited tremendously from this law, I see the conflation of those as archaic and false. This voluntary assisted dying bill is named as such because of fundamental reasons that challenge some of those arguments. One, and it is named as such, one, voluntary, because it is freely formed choice of the person involved. Two, it is assisted, because medical professional assistance is required to carry it out with dignity. And three, dying because it is at the end of life that it is contemplated. Just this week in this place, we passed landmark reforms of consent law, around consent laws founded on the principle of bodily autonomy and a fundamental element of legal equality before the law, the principle of agency, the right of self-determination in respect of one's own self. While I understand that this principle at times comes into conflict with a person's religious or moral convictions, it is so important to remember that we live in a secular legal democracy, and that, as Michael Bradley notes, to insist on subsuming the universally accepted principle of personal agency below a religious or moral conviction which is not universal is to depart radically from the practice of making laws on a strictly secular basis, to doing so on the basis of personal and controversial beliefs. And I'll resist the urge to compare what that would look like and what it does look like around the world where religious dogma is what informs laws. The main opposition to voluntary assisted dying is being driven by religious clerics and highly motivated religious lobby groups that represent a tiny proportion of the population. As was revealed in Neil Francis's deep research, Religiosity in Australia, personal faith according to the Numbers report, religious clerics are completely out of touch with their congregations. One statistic which we've heard today, and I echo, is 76% of Catholics in 2019 said that they support voluntary assisted dying laws. Greens New South Wales rejects demands for special carve-outs for faith-based institutions. While we support conscientious objection for individual health practitioners, such conscientious objection should not be extended to institutions, especially those that receive large sums of taxpayer money. And I will note, Mr Speaker, to correct the record, the member for Prospect in his speech made a claim that Palliative Care New South Wales was against voluntary assisted dying bill. But I have been informed by them through the member for Sydney, and I quote, "Additional and ongoing funding for palliative care and voluntary assisted dying can coexist," end of quote. Religious hospitals and aged care homes should have to provide access to legal healthcare services, which would include voluntary assisted dying once enacted into law, if they wish to qualify for government funding. I understand, Mr Speaker, that for some people, voluntary assisted dying will not be something that they will choose based on their religious and moral beliefs, and that is why I'm proud to live in a democratic society. But we must not prevent the overwhelming majority of people in our community who wish to have the option of voluntary assisted dying, with important safeguards. To be denied this because of the religious beliefs of a few, particularly in this secular place, is beggars belief. Suffering at the end of life with a terminal illness and the capacity to choose assisted dying is not meaningful. Suffering is not meaningful. Throughout my time as the member for Ballina, I have received countless emails and phone calls from constituents who have endured the miserable passing of a loved one, the painful, painful watch of them at end of life, terminally ill, and palliative care for whom that does not relieve their suffering. Listening to these stories is gut-wrenching and makes me wonder why, as a civilised state, we will allow this to continue. I want to share briefly Kathy Barry, one of my constituents' story about the wretched end of her brother's life. In 2019, at the age of 69, Kathy's brother Tom was diagnosed with untreatable metastatic facial cancer. His doctor gave him 6 months to live, and Tom did die 6 months and 2 weeks later in Ballina. When Tom asked his doctor about how he would likely die, he was told that his demise would involve choking, pneumonia, skin eruptions, strokes and bleeding. After his diagnosis, Tom asked his siblings twice to help him end his life to prevent the suffering he was enduring, and the worst was yet to come. Unfortunately, Kathy and her siblings had to tell Tom that there was nothing they could do to help him because he lived in New South Wales. Tom received excellent end-of-life care from his doctors and nursing staff. Nevertheless, he still suffered terribly in the last weeks of his life. Specialist palliative care for his severe pain and anxiety gradually stopped working in the month before he died. Tom started to experience loss of consciousness, incontinence and difficulty swallowing. Sadly, Tom passed away in Ballina Hospital after enduring several weeks of unimaginable pain, severe and unrelenting, which could no longer be relieved. Mr Speaker, could I have a short extension?
Member for Ballina is requesting an extension of time. All those in favour say aye. Against say no. Very enthusiastically, you get an extra time. Thank you, Member for Ballina.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tom was denied the chance to die with dignity, instead spending his last days in agony. His family sat beside him in hospital as he moaned, screamed and clenched his hands and cried over days and nights. In his final week of life, Tom could barely speak, uttering only 2 words during that week: inhumane and help. I share that story with Kathy's permission and her family's permission, because I do not believe in using people's suffering for political gain. But the reality is that pain management does not alleviate the suffering of everyone, and many live and die with unacceptable levels of pain and suffering from terminal illnesses at end of life. As Dr. Catherine Fraser put it, witnessing a dying relative linger in the final stages of life Having decided to deny medical treatment and refuse food is hell. With voluntary assisted dying, death can be painless and peaceful. When a practitioner's ability to act with compassion is limited by the law, they are in effect acting against their primary goal to relieve suffering. Dr. Fraser articulated it very well for me when she said, I quote, "I think of euthanasia as choosing to die prematurely. I see voluntary assisted dying as choosing how to die when death is imminent." And that, Mr. Speaker, is a very, very sharp distinction. There are many safeguards built into this legislation. I'm going to refrain from going through them, but I want to assure my constituents and I want to assure everyone who has reached out to me that I am very confident that those built-in safeguards, those checks and balances, do ensure that the scheme is not abused for improper motives. And I pledge that I will be monitoring this, as will all members of this place. We know that at any stage these laws can be reviewed, and indeed they will be reviewed. Mr. Speaker, I hope that before the end of this month that I can say to my community that voluntary assisted dying palliative care is now available in the state of New South Wales.
I thank the member for